and trying to bring them into one umbrella ecosystem. So we shouldn't differentiate between entrepreneurs in retail or in junior mining or in agri-tech or any other sector. We should be trying to create the same conditions for them to thrive, regardless of what businesses that they run. And so let's talk about this right now. But also, as we speak, may we remember that, yes, initially when you start a business, it's a great idea. It's a solving a problem, perhaps in your local community or economy. It's seeing a competitive advantage, but it's initially really small and survivalist. Once you break free from that early stage reality, you move into the almost mid-tier range. And that's really where you can catapult significant growth and expansion into new markets. We want to talk about that level of entrepreneurship. What is often called the missing middle is, once you've gotten to a point where you've scaled up your 2, 3, 4 businesses that you're running or branches that you're running, how do you become a mid-range business, perhaps with a turnover that is nearing the 50 million rand mark, for instance, or anywhere between 5 and 50 million rand mark? How do we get you to that level where really and truly you are now a dynamic employer in the economy, a dynamic taxpayer in the economy, and could really create what Miriam spoke of earlier on, a national champion? You're emerging to become a national champion. So if you think about it, when I hear those words, national champion, I remember that in 1992, as South Africa was negotiating its transition to democracy, 2 companies were born at that stage. One of them is Discovery and one of them is MTN. I don't have to tell you, more than 30 years later, what they've become. So those companies in 1992 were mid-tier companies started by the dreamers. Today, they are core to the South African economy and to the profile of the South African economy. How do we get some of these companies to become that in a 10, 15, 20, 30-year cycle? That's really the conversation we want to unpack right now. Our panelists for this segment are Dr. Neva Makgetla, who's a trade and industrial policy expert, who's with Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, otherwise known as TIPS. She will give us the overview of this topic, unlocking South Africa's cooperative economy. And then she'll be joined by Mr. Andile Ngube, Cooperative Banking Promotion and Advancement, from the Cooperative Banking Promotion and Advancement, CPBA. They'll be joined by Mr. Peter Sido, who is the CEO of the Vumelana Advisory Fund. And then they'll be joined by Ms. Bertha Dlamini, who's the Group Chief Executive Officer of Rito Group of Companies. She's also the president of a somewhat new establishment, 2-3 years old, Women in Energy, taking advantage of burgeoning opportunities in the new deregulated energy economy. I know that Dr. Makgetla will be doing her presentation online. So what I will do is I will sit down, give her space, and then we will join the conversation with the other 3 participants. As she joins us online, I see you. Good morning. But may I say good morning also, well, good afternoon now that it's noon, to more than 100 delegates who are watching online. Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you, Dr. Makgetla.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you for this opportunity and also for the interesting discussions this morning. I want to speak first briefly to those debates, which, this issue of inclusion versus growth is something we've been hearing about for a while. And I think what's important, what comes out of the discussion here, is that we actually need both, but that we need to think more carefully about our strategies to achieve them. That we need complementary strategies that will both support established and high-end formal production, but also think about how we can create jobs and small businesses, rather than just overburdening policies on both sides to the point where they don't work. And then one thing I just wanted to flag, because I think it shapes how we think about small business today. The growth in the 2010s was really based in an international metals price boom, because more than half of our exports still derive from mining, either mining products themselves, like ores, and coal, or also metals and refined products like the petrochemicals that Sasol creates from coal. It wasn't about industrialization. And what that meant was that growth was linked to increasing output in ways that also created more jobs on a large scale. We didn't see that much higher productivity. We saw higher prices leading to higher production. For instance, in platinum, where employment doubled in the 10 years to 2010. And that will have more of a trickle-down effect. But if we don't have that kind of growth in overall production without higher productivity, it doesn't really work just to say we can copy East Asian industrialization, which was based heavily on raising productivity, but then also raising demand by going into international markets. And the problem is that when you raise productivity, unless you can scale up demand, you will have lower employment levels. But today, international markets have been stagnant. If you look at total global trade, even before the US invaded Iran. So what that means is we're competing for market share with countries like China and Vietnam, which are well established in terms of both their market relationships and their infrastructure going to the global north, and where wages are about the same as what we have, whereas they were competing with countries in the global north where wages are much higher. So I think we have to be realistic about what is possible. And then the other thing to note about China and Vietnam, which is relevant particularly to this discussion, is that they have much higher levels of small business and have had for the last 50 years. So in China, in other upper middle income countries, excluding China, around 20% of all adults are small business owners in the sense they are employers or they are self-employed. In South Africa, the figure is 5%. And we know why that is. It's because under apartheid, small businesses were destroyed on a mass scale because they were African owned, both in farming and in urban areas. And in fact, numerically, that's like the key reason why we have such a low share of all working people with employment. In South Africa, about 40% of working age people have employment. Like I said, only about 5% are self-employed or employers. In the rest of other upper middle income countries, around 55 to 60% of the population is employed, and of those, around a quarter are self-employed or employers. And so you can see that destruction of small business is really the problem that we have to address in some ways. If we need to understand the implications of the way apartheid affected small business if we want to come up with good solutions. It doesn't help us to continuously say, well, some people made it, because if we want to have, a really significant increase in the number of small businesses, including collectively owned as well as privately owned, it doesn't help us to say, well, some people made it, because by definition, if you want to do it on a larger scale, it has to be possible for ordinary people who are not particularly talented, who are not highly qualified, who aren't just plain lucky, to be able to establish successful businesses. And so I think what we really have to say is actually two questions in the light of what the panel's about. The one question is, why is it that small businesses in South Africa have not recovered from the apartheid destruction, 30 years after the end of apartheid, on the one hand, and on the other hand, why in that context do we not have a strong co-op movement? Because I think we can say our co-op movement is intellectually and ideologically strong, but it doesn't really have the numbers that you see in some countries like Japan and Europe. So just quickly, since I'm probably running out of time, I think what's important is to understand is that when small businesses were destroyed over the last 50 years, the ecosystem that would support them was also destroyed. So Miriam talked about just being able to get to market, but it's also about getting supplies. It's about getting training and extension services. It's about knowing how to run accounts. It's about having the kinds of infrastructure you need to run a business, physical infrastructure like roads, telecoms, and so on. And the problem is the market tends to reproduce that lack of an ecosystem because it's not worthwhile to set up those systems when there's no customers because there are no small businesses. So you need collective action through government or through other kinds of agencies that can set up systems to support businesses that don't have inherited assets and experience. As Miriam said, one of the problems is, one of the reasons you get this reproduction is people have not inherited either assets or experience or, just plain shops or other kinds of businesses that they can just take over. They have to start from scratch. And if we don't have systems to help overcome that lack, it won't happen spontaneously through the market. And I think that the real question we should be talking about is what would it take to structure and to resource more support, bearing in mind that structural change is hard and will take decades. It took decades to destroy small businesses in South Africa. You can't just say, well, wave a magic wand and do one or two small things and everything will work fine. And what I would also argue is that what's critical is to think about clusters and schemes that rely, as Miriam kind of talked about, but I would say it has to go beyond just the access to market issues. That we need to say, how do we build on strengths in the economy where we have capacity to help us develop holistic systems for small businesses? So like, often what you see, for instance, in forestry and sugar, you have contracting out where the forestry or sugar companies, they need the raw material, so they support small growers to produce it, partially for political reasons in the case of sugar, because they want to be able to say they create employment, but that's fine if it works. We also have things like franchising. We have the gig schemes. All of these things are ways of creating an environment where through a couple of centralized interventions, you create an environment where small businesses can succeed. And that's what we need to talk about is what would the ecosystem look like that would enable small businesses to succeed? And how can we intervene most effectively to create those systems? And by the way, who's going to pay is always the issue. In terms of why we don't have a stronger co-op movement, I do think part of the reason is just in the English tradition, you see it both in the US and the UK, the overall co-op movement is simply much weaker than what you see in Japan and in Europe. So again, the systems have not really been established in a country like South Africa that follows UK law that would make it easy for co-ops to be established. And there is also not a tradition, for instance, of, we were hearing about stockfells. They're not formalized the way they would be in a country like Japan or in Europe, where large enterprises have their own savings associations set up already. And I think, there's a couple of reasons why, but I think one of the things we have to look at is where the co-op movement is strong. The bulk of the movement is in financial co-ops and consumer co-ops. So savings schemes and consumer co-ops where people get together to manage shops where they can buy consumer goods. And there's a reason for that. It's very hard to set up producer co-ops. We've been saying it's hard to set up a small business. It's even harder when you add a new kind of management style and incentives that nobody is familiar with and that require very different choices that often run against the logic of the market in terms of saying, for instance, we share as opposed to we just have one person make all the profit. And we have to have collective decision making and mandating and accounting, and those things are very difficult to do, particularly when we've never done it before. I do think it might be worth, therefore, thinking also about how do we think about the social economy in general, what it is, what is the nonprofit economy like? We know it's more extensive than what is captured in the data from our own personal experience. And again, stockfells being an example, but also all kinds of engagements within the family, with care work, with the public services and so on. And how can we support that kind of production as well on a broader scale? Because that's really about what are the producers trying to achieve rather than just about the internal management system like a co-op is. And I just want to flag again, I think the point of financial and consumer co-ops, and I see panel members know more about this than I do, but the logic is really easy for members to see, and that makes it much more easy to organize and to operate. And it's particularly important where people have limited access to the existing large-scale formal services, for instance, in terms of rural retail, township retail sometimes in some places, but also just in terms of financial services, where people don't really have access to the big formal banks that are not really designed to serve working people. So yeah, I hope we will be able to have a serious discussion about these things. And I think what's important is to be thinking again, what are the systemic changes that would make it easier for small businesses to grow rapidly on scale and create the employment that we need so desperately, as well as promoting economic growth? Thank you very much.
Just before I introduce our panels, if you'll allow us, Dr. Makgetla, I'd just like you just to clarify something that you've raised, just so that you set the tone for us. When we talk about holistic systems for small businesses, and you use the examples in Vietnam and other parts of high growth economies, what would it look like in a South African context? What would the structure, the policies, the socials, the support schemes, the funding look like in a holistic system?
I mean, I think we know if so, for instance, we can also learn from examples we have. So with the forestry schemes, the issue is the forest companies, they need more land and they can't find land outside of historically collective ownership areas in the historic labor sending areas. You know, what they do is they provide people with the plants. They provide them with a lot of extension services to grow the plants. They pay for the maintenance of those plants for 7 years until they've grown to the point where they can be harvested. And then if there's any money left over after they sell the wood, it goes to the people who grew the trees. Now, that system can be truly exploitative because after 7 years, you may find they say, no, price is down this year, you get very little or nothing. So I think it's very important to think about how do you protect both sides. But the holistic part there is you're saying to people who've never grown this kind of crop before, here's the skills, here's the technology, here, you know, we will help with the harvesting, we'll get it to market, and here are the inputs. That's a whole ecosystem you're creating there. Similarly, think about franchises. This is what we do with franchises. The problem with franchises is you often have to pay a huge amount up front. And as Miriam said, if there's no demand, you can't make a business work. And one of our problems is in townships and working class areas, because our cities are segregated so much by income, in working class communities, there's often not much demand. So then the question is also, what can you do to stimulate demand, for instance, through government subsidies for necessities? Like when we were putting in the hot water geysers that were solar based and government paid for that. But also, how do you ensure, for instance, that there are sites where you can set up the franchise, that those sites have access to public transport as well as parking, that they have adequate electricity, that they have something to protect them from load shedding and so on, and from, by the way, also now loss of water. All of these issues, you would need some kind of agency with the capacity. So it's not just the small business battling on its own to try and develop all these things that were destroyed under apartheid, but rather so that we do it on a scale and we develop clusters where the people can share the infrastructure, and so it's cheaper for each individual enterprise. I hope that answers your question. It is a hard question. If we had the answers, we wouldn't be here now.
Thank you for that. I think it really sets the tone for the conversation we're going to have now. So allow me to introduce to you those who will join you, Dr. Niva Makgetla, Andile Ngube from the Cooperative Banking Promotion Advancement Agency, Mr. Peter Sato, the CEO of the Vumelana Advisory Fund, and Ms. Bertha Dlamini, the Group CEO of the Rito Group of Companies. She's also the President of the Women in Energy Forum. Please, can you join us? And of course, we are talking about unlocking South Africa's cooperative economy. That would be cooperative from a regulatory or policy framework, funding framework, and also finding and aggregating entrepreneurs who are producing at scale. That would be my chair, Bertha. Thank you. And then trying to come up with policies that support them all. Perhaps just by way of introduction, each person can just introduce themselves and tell us what you do, so that we understand where you fit into the cooperative framework. Bertha, you first.
Thank you. I am the founding president of African Women in Energy and Power. We're a nonprofit company with a mission to support and accelerate entrepreneurs across multiple energy value chains. We've got 32 chapters across the continent, and most of our programs are executed in South Africa within the Just Energy Transition Skills Development Program, supported by EWCETA and Wits Business School as an academic partner. And we work with entrepreneurs from different sectors who want to diversify into the energy space, and we work with utility professionals so that they can also facilitate just energy transition within their jurisdictions.
Okay.
Good afternoon, colleagues. The name is Andy Lengube. I come from Small Enterprise Development and Finance Agency within the Cooperative Banking Promotion and Advancement Unit. It was previously known as Cooperative Banking Development Agency under National Treasury. We provide all sorts of capacity building for cooperative financial institutions across the country. And yeah, basically that's what we do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Program Director. My name is Peter Seto. I'm the Chief Executive of Melana Advisory Fund. We are a non-profit organization. We assist beneficiaries of land reform largely. As you know, land reform is one of the key challenges that we face as a country. We do that through supporting them with transactional advisory support in order to really structure commercial arrangements between beneficiaries of land reform on the one hand and the private sector. These are private investors. We work through independent transaction advisors who have got a whole set of skills from deal facilitation, finance, and generally communication. So that's what we do. We also support beneficiaries of land reform through capacitating them, because I mean it's one thing to give them the land, because once the land has been given to them or they've entered into this commercial transactions with beneficiaries of land reform, it's important that they must be good partners, and we do that through capacity building, helping them to develop policies and procedures, etc. We've got a number of projects that we are currently, exciting projects that we are currently working on, where we are supported by, for example, the First Rand Empowerment Foundation and the Sanlam Foundation, primarily earmarked at capacitating those beneficiaries of land reform. So we are a relatively small organization, thrown into the deep end. Yeah, but we can talk about that.
All right. So I've heard quite a few things from what's been said, and I think, we will make alignments and adjustments as we go along. But I also am hearing you talk about land as opportunity for agriculture, but land as collateral, land performing many, many different tasks as well. Land as an asset, financial services and different funding models, and then new sectors opening up, such as energy, and making sure that women are not forgotten in that new energy economy as it emerges, and skilling them. So perhaps let's bring you, Bertha, into the conversation now. For you, when we talk about cooperative, dynamic, collective enterprise, what are the greatest opportunities you see? Energy is obviously one of them, the new energy economy opening up. So talk to us about that.
So I think to map the scale of opportunity, we need to speak to some numbers and some concepts. So in South Africa, we are struggling with energy security and not energy access. We are about 80, maybe 90% electrified, but we have massive projects that are coming up, 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines that will affect 188 municipal electricity utilities that are licensed to distribute electricity. We've got a massive distribution network that requires refurbishment, maintenance. We've got a small scale embedded generation that's affecting our energy system. When we look at the rest of the continent, and it's important to look at the rest of the continent, we have 600 million people that are without access to electricity, 900 million people without access to clean cooking electricity. Now, clean cooking energy, that's the right term. Now, this presents a plethora of intersectional opportunities across multiple value chains. When you look at entrepreneurs, South African entrepreneurs, as the previous speaker has said, we have dismantled and dissipated the support base for entrepreneurs for many years. And we are at a fractured moment where we have small-scale entrepreneurs trying to penetrate a capital-intensive market. And I identify it as an opportunity, and we do work there because it's the backbone of all other industries. Agriculture requires energy, manufacturing requires energy, and therefore it presents the catalytic opportunity for entrepreneurs to thrive. But we don't have tailored financing mechanisms for the archetype of entrepreneur that we have on the ground. There's a misfit between what the formal sector, the banking sector, the venture capitalists want to finance because of their risk approach versus what is reality on the ground. Yet in South Africa, for women, I can't remember the ratio, but four women are likely to identify themselves as entrepreneurs. So the entrepreneurial capacity is there, the support mechanisms which covers the follows: access to finance, access to technology, access to information, access to skills development, access to networks, all of which are essentials for growing, whether it's an individual enterprise or a cooperative, to that level that you were speaking about earlier on, the 50 million mark. Another challenge is...
May I ask you just to hold on? I think Dr. Makgetla, I stand to be corrected. I suspect you're not on mute. If I may ask you just to mute yourself, and then we'll come back to you in the audience reflections.
No, I am muted. That's somebody else. Sorry. At least it shows muted.
Thank you.
So we're talking about for women to, exactly. So you also have the challenge that the procurement models that are in place. We have one of the world-renowned auction programs for renewable energy. However, it requires firm and heavy balance sheets. It requires a track record in developing large-scale utility projects. And none of us as entrepreneurs have had that opportunity to be exposed to designing the commercial models that are required, or even to have the capital that enables you to prepare a bankable project that you can present to financiers. So there's a huge gap of support, tailored support to what is a reality on the ground. Yeah.
All right. So I believe maybe one of the statistics you were looking for is they say that within the formal economy, 45% of those employed are women. So you find women at whatever level of entrepreneurship, mainly outside of what we call the mainstream economy, and they need the security, the capital, the numeration, and the access to resources, because they've already built businesses. That's where they are. And they need to rise up. And I mean, I know I'm talking informality, but many are also formally registered SMEs, but you don't find women working for someone. The majority of those are working for themselves.
Yes, and these challenges don't only affect women. So if we look at building an inclusive energy ecosystem, you have to look at the youth, unemployed youth. You have to look at persons with disability. You have to look at women, and you have to look at men as well, because the monolithic nature of the electricity system has kept localization at the marginal periphery of the market. So if we are going to catalyze the growth of cooperatives and entrepreneurs to that level of the 50 million and above, we have to rethink how we support, first, the understanding of the constructs of value chains. I always use this example. All of us are quite educated. If I ask, what is the value chain of a teaspoon? Most people can't articulate that value chain. Yet it has got a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities that are hidden because our basic education system does not teach us the construct of value chains, and therefore the ability to identify entry points in any value chains that presents the lowest barriers to entry. So first is creating the awareness of these opportunities and how you can capture these opportunities and support mechanisms that are available for those opportunities.
Angela, let's bring you into the conversation here, because Bertha has really spent a lot of her intervention speaking about financial opportunities, institutions, and models. And I know there's going to be a conversation later in the day about different funding mechanisms, but perhaps you can give us a teaser of what people need to expect. And to that point as well, Dr. Makgetla and Ubabundwandwe, they both spoke about missed opportunities, that there are stokvels, which is a collective saving mechanism, 60 billion rands in savings each year in stokvels, and yet nobody's really, well, let me not say nobody, but it doesn't feel like anybody's really thought through how to tap into that stokvel money as a capital raising structure or system for entrepreneurs. But there's 60 million sitting in the economy each year because of stokvels.
Okay, thank you for that. I think it was one of the points that I was going to discuss on the opportunities that are available, right? So, the issue of stokvels, for example, it's something that we delve a lot into, because stokvels in most cases, they're used for consumption instead of being seen as a vehicle for capitalizing businesses, and that's where the cooperative banking model comes in, right? So I think at the core of local economy, cooperative banks could be very instrumental in catalyzing, the growth of businesses in local areas, because how these institutions are built is that they are built on a common bond. So with a common bond, basically, we have three types. According to the regulation, the PA regulation, an institution has to have like three types of common bond, right? It can either be associational, it can either be geographic, or it will be employer-based, right? So if it's geographic, then it means people of a certain area have agreed to come together and open an institution that would speak to the needs of that area in particular, or institutions, maybe, for example, you take unions, for example, that SADU Union has a cooperative banking institution. It's known as SADU Sako. So the common bond is everyone who is affiliated to the union. So already there, you can see that there is opportunities in collective activity. But however, the problem is having it structured, right? So cooperative banking institutions can provide the structure to those collective activities. So the other day I was at SADU, we're doing our intervention, and the manager of SADU, of the SACO said their union has 280,000 in membership, yet the SACO, the CBI, has has just over 1% of that 280%. They have about 3,000 in membership. So already that's a missed opportunity, because with these institutions, you are able to create financial products that would, be instrumental in funding the small enterprises and ensure that there is, scalable growth in those local economies. So I think at the core of whatever that we do, right, I think for the longest of time, I felt like this model has been looked, I think that it hasn't been given like enough attention. And I think it can be a very important vehicle in driving growth in these local areas.
And I have to apologize, I've so disrespected stokvels. It's 60 billion, not 60 million in circulation. But, what other lessons can we learn from countries that have had the courage to deploy these collective funding systems? I think an example was raised earlier is because Kenya is largely an agriculture-based economy, and it has, primary agriculture, agro-processing, etc. Financial institutions came up and said, we need to fund our farmers and farming-related economies and markets. And that's why you've got leading banks being cooperative banks, largely with that kind of agricultural backbone or history. What lessons can we learn from different places, New Zealand?
Yes.
And other parts of the world?
Okay, so what I've noticed, reading through these other countries, right, the regulation, for example, it's a bit lax in those countries. and they have a lot of advocacy at national level. Even Parliament, they ensure that they promote this cooperative banking model. So in our country, there's little advocacy for this sector. So, for an example, in our country, the commercial banks command well over 99% in assets, while the sector commands 0.0093%. So if you look at that alone, you can see that, there isn't, this is an industry that has so much potential, yet it is not even like moved. It's not even like tapped into, So I think in other countries, what they do different is, there is advocacy at national level, and for an example, in the US, there is like societies that are mainly made to promote this model. Even the government personals, they're also like one of the members of those institutions. So that way, there's a lot of advocacy, and I think another thing that we do here in South Africa that is different to other countries is that these institutions, when we open them, there is a lot of dependency on the government, instead of being self-sufficient. For that reason, like the reason for opening up these institutions is mainly just to source funding from the government, instead of having a vision and a mission to have sustainable institutions that can actually like grow, and so I think that's where our problem is. It also lies also with the education, ensuring that people are well educated in terms of what these institutions stand for and what they can actually get out of these institutions.
All right. I'm going to come to you now, Peter Sito, also because you work a lot in the land reform sector and, from the acquisition to the inputs. And one of the things we hear is that land is an asset. And many people own land. It's not just, we focus so much, the conversation in South Africa focuses so much on private owners. And yet, you can correct me here, we're told that the largest stock of available land actually sits in the hands of government and municipalities. So that's where you find a lot of available land that can be leased for small businesses. If tribal chiefs are able to give you land access, you can use that as collateral. There's many ways to start to, I think, monetize land as well as use it. Maybe you can give us an understanding.
I think it's important, firstly, to just share some numbers, because sometimes when you talk about these things without necessarily talking about the scale, we end up just being all over the place. I mean, initially, when I was invited to this conference, I thought it's focusing on cooperatives. What does it have to do with land reform? But I mean, just to paint the scene, we've got in excess of 191,000 registered co-ops. A lot of those are inactive as we speak. Very, very few are actually active. Now, what attracted me more to this conference is that we are not just only focusing on cooperatives, but we are also focusing on community organizations, and how we can actually leverage what they've got, their assets and their entrepreneurial spirit, in order to change the lives of our people. Now, if you look at your communal property associations as an example, we've got in excess of 1,600 communal property associations in this country. A good 80% of them are not compliant. Close to 10 million hectares of land have already been transferred to beneficiaries of land reform. Of that, it is estimated that a good 70% thereof is no longer productive. So we are really talking about, we've got a real crisis, although we don't always want to say this is a crisis. But I mean, can you imagine if we were to turn around some of this transferred land to make sure that it's productive, it can actually create much needed jobs? You raised an issue to say government and the municipalities are on vast tracts of land. a lot of land that government bought was for land reform purposes. It was supposed to be for land redistribution. Remember, land reform has got 3 legs: land redistribution, and others. But just for a moment to focus on the land that's sitting in the hands of government. Some of these land parcels have been, leased to our people. Now, if you lease these land parcels to people without really providing them with, title deeds, you are setting them up for failure, because they can't even go to the formal financial services sector in order to raise loans. So the more we try to do things, I think the more we take a step back. And it would be a sad day if these 1,600 entities go the same route that these cooperatives have actually gone. We've had co-ops in this country for decades, for many, many, many years. The communal property associations only started about 20, 30 years ago, but we are seeing monumental failures. My organization, Fumelana Advisory Fund, has been intervening by way of, trying to negotiate partnerships between the private sector, because they've got access to capital, they've got access to markets, and they've got the technical know-how. And we believe that is the quickest way through which we can turn things around, because for us to sit back and actually expect that we can depend on government to fund all of this is really, we are wasting time.
Just on this one issue, don't want to belabor it. Perhaps you can help me. In some countries, there's an island just off the coast of East Africa, where they say if you've got X amount of money, the equivalent of about 6-7 million rands, you can lease land for 99 years, even get a resident permit, and you can do whatever you want that's commercial and productive on that land. Do we not have similar programs in South Africa? Because we also shouldn't limit ourselves in thinking land is just for farming. It's important for food security, but you can build real estate. There are many things you could be doing on that land. You could build shopping centers if that's what the community needs. You're talking about titles, so you can't use it as collateral, but you can commercialize it. What's an impediment here?
I think there's a chicken and egg story here, because we are talking about commercializing. I mean, how do you, in order to commercialize, you actually need funding. And in order to get funding, you must show the funder that, one, you've got the technical expertise, this is your land, etc., etc. But I think over and above that, I think as a country, we need to have a serious conversations around, how do we deal with obstacles to access to affordable finance, not just access to finance, because in some instances, those very few ones, lucky ones, have got access to finance, but at what rate? And it's almost like setting them up for failure.
Right. So the cost of capital is really expensive. And I think that brings us now into this issue, Bertha and Andile, on the capability gaps that SMMEs face, right? Everybody's going to say funding, but what else?
So I just wanted to add to what I call him Bro Peter. By the way, 27 years ago, he was my boss. So I'm quite privileged and very honored.
And now you're a business owner. So thank you, Bro Peter.
To add to what he's saying, for microgrids that could power a shopping center or power 20 families or even more, you need land. You need land, you need the technical skills to design a technical model and a commercial model on the capacity of electricity that the plant that you're planning to build will generate, and at what rate you will sell it to the municipality or to the shopping center. And the challenges we're finding again is lack of access to land, or having land where a title deed is in the hands of a family trust, or it's nowhere. So even the very basic assets required to at least give confidence to a financier that there is an asset that they can bet on, collateralize, is not available. When we talk about access to affordable finance, that's critical because, and that's why I made the comparison earlier, that what financial institutions are willing to offer to entrepreneurs is not affordable. It's technically complex, and entrepreneurs do not have the competence within themselves to decode the agreements to meet the requirements of the financier. So we have to, indeed, he's right, we have to have a very real conversations around how we tailor make solutions for entrepreneurs on the ground. The stats I was struggling with earlier on is that 4 in 10 women identify as entrepreneurs, but they're survivalist entrepreneurs in the informal sector. Because gaining entry into the formal sector, the cost of regulatory compliance is something that's prohibitive. Even if what we have done is we have said across our 15 countries, let's pool entrepreneurs that are of scale. In this way, we have a portfolio of project concepts that financiers can help us to build the commercial models for. Even that is not working because it costs at least 250 to R1 million to build a fundable model with experts. So the technical expertise you're talking about is even if we have a collection of engineers or as a team of entrepreneurs, we bring our expertise, it is still not sufficient because those that we are gaining finance from and those that we are obtaining power purchase agreements from want a track record of delivering the project. So even if individually we have the track record, the trading entity, the legal entity does not have a track record, and therefore it's not recognized and therefore it cannot compete. So, and I may have convoluted my point, you do require financial acumen and it's specific financial expertise in designing a commercial model for financing. Yeah. And you must have the technical competence to build the plant, whether it's a waste to energy, solar, wind, right. Battery storage solution, or it is just building the charging stations for electric vehicles. You need the competence to build because the financier is tracing where money is going to come from. So if they give you money and you can't build and therefore you can't fulfill at the point when the plant must be commissioned and generate income so you can start repaying, then you fall into penalties, which you were being set up for failure anyway.
I think what you've just said is so important, but I also think it can be explored on in the later comment, because I've heard DFI say the same thing about big infrastructure projects, sovereign projects, is a lot of money is spent at that due diligence project preparation stage before you've even broken ground. And the commercial, the bankability that we talk about is once you start producing, but you don't just start producing, you're building up the stock to start producing, and all that admin, paperwork, proof of concept costs money. Okay, yes, sir.
Yeah, I think one of the key issues that we identified in our line of work was compliance is expensive, and some of these institutions, they fail because they tend to find it extremely difficult to cope with the regulatory requirements that come with being, a cooperative banking institution, for an example. So in our line of work, what we do is we try to, assist these institutions so that they can stay afloat by making sure that we help them develop policies and stick to those policies so that they are compliant, because compliance on its own, it's a huge issue. And I think one of the things we've also identified was these institutions tend to work in isolation, and there isn't, cooperation amongst those institutions. And it's a setback because in some instances, other companies or banks were able to, leverage on their numbers, they would come together and then they would have a shared, type of services, where they sort of like come together and buy equipment, machinery, so that they can, be able to, produce at the highest level. So I think cooperation amongst these institutions also is a problem, but when I look at it, it sometimes seems as if it's it's something that was put there so that they cannot go beyond.
Right.
But I think it's a culture that we would need to sort of like enforce in these institutions so that they can come together and then realize the power that they have in numbers.
All right.
Yeah.
There is. Let me go to Dr. Makgetla, because I think she spoke and then she's been listening in. There is a concept of the missing middle. And I have to admit, I'd never understood the missing middle, or I'd never heard of the missing middle in terms of the enterprise development landscape versus the missing middle when we speak about it in education and funding education. So it's intriguing to me that this concept also exists in this sphere. What do we mean by the missing middle, and why does it persist?
Was that for? Oh, was
That's
that for me?
Dr. Makgetla. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear. Yeah, I think I think that the missing middle in economics is actually about the middle class. So it's about saying in a country like South Africa, because we have unusually deep inequalities, you tend to have very poor people, even if they're employed, and then a few rich people, and you don't have that middle class. And that has a lot of economic, but also political and social ramifications. And I think what it means for businesses, even small, if you look at small formal businesses, they're a world away from informal businesses. And the vast majority of small businesses are in fact informal. The vast majority have no employees. About a third have one employee. The rest are just self-employed. And they range, of course, tremendously between, for instance, taxis and, very informal people who are earning very little and are very unproductive. And I think a lot of it's about how do we think about that gap as well, which to some extent also reflects deep inequalities in the income distribution. So which markets people have access to becomes very important.
So what I'm hearing you say, and you can clarify it for me, the missing middle is about a middle class that's actually getting eroded or getting smaller in South Africa, which we've seen recently. It's about buying power if people have disposable income. And then it is about creating markets, because when you're an entrepreneur, you're selling a product to someone who should have some disposable income to purchase your product. And if people's wages are smaller and people who have that discretionary spending are getting fewer and fewer in number, it starts to have broader ramifications.
I mean, yes, but the one thing I would say is it's not that it's a downward trend. It's that we inherited one of the most unequal economies in the world, and we haven't overcome those inequalities. So there's very little evidence that inequality is getting worse, but it's not getting better. And so compared to other countries, we are just vastly more unequal. And just to give one example, the richest 10% of households account for over half of all consumer expenditure. And even for necessities like food, it's like between 25 and 30%. And what that means is, for instance, if you want to set up a township enterprise, the median income is about, a quarter to a fifth of that you find in the rich suburbs, and that obviously depresses your sale.
All right. Rapita, I'm going to join Bertha on that one. So when we talk about the missing middle, you really nodded. And another concept that keeps coming up is the fragmentation of development programs. Perhaps you can speak to those two issues.
Fragmentation is happening at different levels. Government is supposed to be really the anchor for most of these programs. But if you look at what is happening on the ground, you'll find that you've got a number of government departments who are actually supposed to be, or who are in one form or another, involved in either supporting SMEs or cooperatives, or even communal property associations in the land reform space. But frequently you find that what the left is doing, the right doesn't know what the left is actually doing. Both the left and the right are spending millions of rands, and only if we could just just combine those efforts and try and have better coordination, I think we'll have meaningful impact. And partly some of the challenges that we are really seeing is because of that approach, you know.
Right. I'm ready to take reflections from the audience, but before I do that, very quick, succinct views. How can diversified enterprise ecosystems help with creating some kind of regional economic resilience? I guess this is the solution. What is the solution here?
So I wanted to, when I was preparing for this talk, the missing middle, I think it carries different definitions for different sectors. And I just want to also share this, right? For entrepreneurs, the missing middle, entrepreneurs in energy, are those who have outgrown the restrictive high interest offerings of microfinance institutions, but lack the collateral, extensive multi-year track records, or massive scale required to access traditional corporate banking and private equity. So your funding ticket is too big and too expensive to be financed by a micro lender or a microfinance institution, but you do not have what it takes for a formal finance. And that is where most entrepreneurs are stuck. And that's why we are failing to scale. Now, let's talk about diversified supportive ecosystems. So I led the G20 decentralized energy system output for just energy transition. And one of the solutions we proposed was to pool ecosystem players into a single portal. So whether I am sitting in China, in India, in Russia, or any part of the African continent, I should be able to log onto a portal that takes me to access to technology for whichever energy technology I want to either on trade in my domestic market or I want to develop in my domestic market. And I should have access to webinars, to case studies, to suppliers, to funding models, to YouTubes, etc. Access to finance. I should have, based on the maturity of my enterprise, I should be led to the financing instruments that are suitable for my enterprise. And this should be blended, not just debt, but grants and concessional loans, etc., that is patient enough for the entrepreneur. I should have access to skills development. I should be able to curate my journey to learn to enterprise in my sector of choice. And that should be a syndication of material from different academic institutions and organizations that have accessible data. And we had multiple streams, access to networks. I should be able to jump on a webinar, et cetera, et cetera. That's a diversified ecosystem, right? But bringing it to the palm, where through a smartphone or a laptop, I can tap into the information and the technical know-how that I need.
Andile, maybe you can do the same, because I think as somebody who works in finance, Bertha's raised an interesting issue, which is the missing middle here is that you're too big for a micro lender, too small for the commercial lenders. You're stuck somewhere. But also, how do you then, once you solve that problem, how do you create diversified ecosystems?
Okay, so I think one of the things that we identified was that, you know, what these, like for example, in Cape Town, there is a cooperative banking institution known as MediCoop. So their common bond is everyone who is in the health space, right? So what they do is they provide funding for these youngsters that are fresh from university but do not have capital to start their own establishments, you know, and they've done that, and they've done extremely well, because I think they have now over 400 enterprises that are, taken care by the institution. So I think the most important thing is identifying, like a problem, right? Identifying a problem and then creating a solution based on the identified problem. So in the case of people that are in the energy space, it's always a good idea to open their own cooperative banking institution the banking institution would then speak to the needs of those people specifically, because it will be industry focused. So I think the most important thing is to understand that with a cooperative banking model, you are able to have an institution that addresses key issues in a specific industry. And that way you are able to sort of like diversify your the portfolio of what the CBIs will be focusing on.
Interesting.
And then in terms of diversification, there is a concept in risk management that when you diversify your portfolio, you reduce the risk of default. So I think the most important thing is that by diversifying, you kill that dependency on certain institution to provide products and services, and then that creates a resilient economic environment for all other institutions to thrive in.
Right.
Yeah.
Peter, over to you. Diversified enterprise ecosystems, and I love this word because if there are different areas where you can either borrow money, earn money, you become more resilient. The system becomes more resilient.
I think linked to that point is despite the challenges that we've raised around access to finance, etc., the reality is the funding ecosystem in South Africa is not completely broken.
It's not.
It's not. It's just inaccessible, particularly for small to medium businesses that are not investment ready. So we've got capital, we've got institutions like these organizations, we've got a number of incentives that are provided by government departments, we've got grant mechanisms that are actually around, we've got development finance channels that are around, we've got buyers who are looking for deals. What's missing really is the support to package an investment case. I think if we can find a creative way through which we could fund the support for these entities to really package investment case, then I think that would be a very good start.
And to you, Neva Makgetla, diversified enterprise ecosystems, what can be done?
I mean, I think that the most important step is to think of it in terms of how do we set up, use intermediaries to structure holistic support rather than just saying we'll do finance, we'll do trading, we'll just focus on one or two things, which are fine where you already have a base, but are not adequate for new companies and new entrepreneurs trying to do new things in most cases.
Right. Now's an opportunity for us just to take 5 to 10 minutes of audience reflections. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Afternoon. My name is Lusanda Nechidende from TAP. I mean, it was an interesting conversation.
May I ask you to get closer to the mic?
Am I not audible? It was an interesting conversation. I mean, I come from financing myself, and I liked what Peter actually took the words out of my mouth with his last statement that there's no shortage of financing in the country. I think the issue is how we make sure that it's appropriately accessed and how we manage expectations. Because my worry is always when I hear words like affordable financing, it's creating an expectation to an SMME or an entrepreneur that there is such a thing. There isn't. There is appropriately priced financing. So it's priced for the risk that the funder is perceiving for your business, for your background, for the sector you're in, etc. What we're not using, though, sufficiently as a country is the ability to support intermediaries to provide blended finance, because that's where the concept of affordability might come in. Because if an intermediary might be able to package for a startup, a mix of grant here, some concession there, and obviously priced money, it might make access a little easier. But, when it comes, I was many years ago, maybe just over 25 years ago, involved in cooperatives. And the reason that housing cooperatives failed was really around financial governance. Because I always make the point that a marriage between two people is hard enough. Suddenly you have 5, 10 people being cooperative members and having to decide on the financial fortunes of this business. It always just falls apart. at those basic principles. The issue is how do you then support them to structure themselves appropriately as a business that can take resolutions where if a funder comes in, there's a clear line of who is going to provide surety or guarantee. That's an important thing, and most cooperatives are not able to do so. And in what legal form are they organized into becomes important. And obviously there's, the Cooperative Act. I don't know if it still exists and whether it's been updated, but I know that back in the day, we spent a lot of time trying to create the policy environment that guides it. But the issue is not the lack of policy. The issue is on the ground practically. What are the skills that you are teaching a cooperative to run like a PTY? Because at the end of the day, they are running business, they're managing money, they need to run like a PTY. And then the last point I wanted to make, and I think Peter was making the point around title deeds, it's very important, obviously, for you to be able to access finance and to be able to show your strength is that I have this title deed. But we shouldn't discount that leasehold is as important. The issue is for how long? Long-term leases have been around in the country for many years. 99 years is a standard, and we fund against leasehold of 99 years. But we're starting to see, for instance, the city of Joburg now wanting to release buildings for 45 years. It's not enough. 45 years is not enough time for a funder to roll funding and refinance an asset sufficiently. So you start being nervous financing that. But when it's 99 years, I mean, you and I will be dead in 99 years. And you think it's just as good as a title, so we shouldn't discount the power of a long-term lease, but there's no need to change what already works because it's always been 99 years, but now we're starting to see government wanting to reduce it to lower.
That's such valuable insight, and I love the analogy with marriage. You marry one person, it's difficult enough. There's 5 of you with different interests, even if you've pooled resources. Who's taking the lead in this? Who's standing surety? So within the cooperative, there should be a kind of a single entity type formation within that cooperative. Got it. Any other comments, reflections? Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And we are taking away from the panelists on ecosystems. Thank you so much. I do understand that we need to build meaningful transformation that will then assist enterprises to work in collaboration, interdependence, and shared value. And, among other ecosystems is business, is digital, which we talk into data and connectivity and innovation, and industry, which is then sector specific, and also funding ecosystem. But I think one thing that I wanted to speak to, maybe to be building from the previous speaker also, to say, I heard you speaking about Stokvels, and, I'm from the community. There was a lot of Stokvel, whether we building houses together and all that. And the most concerning thing when it comes to Stokvel and working together is that issue of governance, the issue of trust, the issue of who's accountable, how many have been built. I can talk to a lot where people came together and say, let's begin a community bank, but where did it end up? Corruption always surfaces, and people come up with a different agenda. How do we then, overcome that kind of a challenge? Let me leave it like that. Thank you.
Important to choose the right treasurer. Any other reflections? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Butomi Hlabangwani. I'm actually a social worker, and it's quite interesting to see a panel that is talking about the future whereby there's going to be a holistic approach. I think Dr. Neva was indicating something about the fact that there is a tappable, resources that we can be utilized as unemployed social worker. So as I stand in here, I'm a social worker who was unemployed some time ago, and I decided to start a private practice whereby I also unlocked the potential that it can be utilized by the most unemployed social workers who are in South Africa. So currently, when you look into the stats, there's about 9,000 unemployed social workers. This is a stats that was done a while back. But when you look at the Social Development Minister, her statement this year, she indicated is 6,000 something. But when you look at KZN has got 3 point something unemployed social workers reported last year. And Eastern Cape has got 1 point something. Those are just two provinces that are going to her number. So now we kind of look at, does the government also have insight as to what is happening to all these people who are going to school to capacitate themselves, get degrees? Now, as an employed social worker, I actually look into the model of social workers empowering themselves by opening private practices. Currently, I mentor about 55 social workers, who many of them have started private practices. But like one of the ladies there indicated, we don't have the capacity to actually know what to do with a business enterprise. Yes, we are into intellectual property. We know that we are registered into PTY LTDs. But in the school system, our modules, there's none that actually capacitated us to actually go and become entrepreneurs. And we look at our council, the council actually started now to have an insight as to what are the circumstances of the social workers, employed and unemployed. But at the same time, there is no one who is willing to step into the table and capacitate us. And when we go and do it, we do it in the means of actually uplifting ourselves. But because we have got no background, we end up with businesses that are just falling apart. So with the Stockfell issue, I would like to actually take that module and bring it into the social worker system so that we can be able to empower ourselves. Might need guidance, but that's something that I'm taking with me today.
All right. So technical skills, technical skills, technical skills. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to any of the comments as we wrap up this session.
I wanted to support or to correct for NGS at least. We are cautious when we talk about affordable finance. We emphasize that any funder who wants to fund wants their money back and some. And unless the project can demonstrate that it's able to generate that within a defined period of time, that's when things fall apart. The support that is required within the ecosystem is building, moving from concept, moving from I have land to I can build a mini grid, I can build a battery energy storage system, I can do X, Y, Z. That bridge, that the technical capability and the financing of that is so critical, and that's what we don't have.
Right. I'd like to respond to the issue of corruption within these financial institutions. Right. So I think that's where one of the things that I think that's where like there is fragmented, approach from the government, because when these institutions come into the fold, they assist them, but as soon as they are part of the fold, they are neglected and they are not given systems, right? And without a system, it's actually hard to track, transactions. It's hard to track any fraudulent activities. So I think that's what CEDFA right now is trying to do. The whole idea of CEDFA was to create a centralized, service provider, from developmental to finance, as well as, capacity building, right? So it's only now under CEDFA that we are able to provide systems, because these institutions are no different to commercial banks. They're regulated by the Prudential Authority. They need to conform to, the FSCA, right? So the issue of a system has been a problem. As a result, there is CODI. CODI is Corporation Deposit Insurance. CODI was not able to, cover some of these institutions because they didn't have a system in place. But now we are in the process of, actually we've already developed a system for the institutions. I think we are about to pilot some of those institutions, and we are hoping that in the near future we'll be able to give them a fully fledged banking system. That way we'll be able to, sort of like monitor how they, do their business, so that there is less fraudulent activities. But I think what also contributes to, fraudulent activities is that there's always that founder syndrome when people open institutions and then the members are not active, the board members are also inactive, so there becomes one individual who's always active and then they do everything for the institution. There's reliance on that individual. As a result, the sustainability of that institution goes in question, So I think it's important to also educate, the members of that institution so that they understand that as a member, you are not just a member, you are also an owner of that institution, because a cooperative banking institution basically is not owned by two individuals or one individual. It's owned by the members of that institution. So a lot of them do not understand the power that they hold, as members. So as a result, they leave, the daily operations of that institution to certain individuals, and those individuals have access to their monies. As a result, they misappropriate their funds. So I think education is also important in that regard.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think one theme that has actually come throughout the deliberations has been an issue around governance. And I think it's an important issue, because for as long as we don't deal with issues around governance, I mean, there's no right-minded funder who would want to associate with an organization that's not properly run. So we need to capacitate our institutions. We need to support them with governance. For example, in the land reform space, my organization is currently developing some, is developing some level of support that will be providing to self-help tools that your communal property associations can actually use in order to improve on their governance. I believe a similar process could be replicated across the co-ops if it's not already available. But compliance is something that we have to enforce. We've got the rules and regulations in this country. What we don't have is actually enforcing what's there, so the regulators need to do their work, but also a carrot and stick approach. You cannot keep on hitting people without incentivizing them so that they can change behavior. So we need to do that more and more. We need to harness the power of stokvels. This is something that's very close to me, most certainly. And I'm sure, Betha, in our previous life, these are the issues that we would have probably taken up. But I think we need to do more rather than really talking about these things. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Those are fantastic interventions. We're going to give the last word to Dr. Neva Makgetla, rounding up everything that we've discussed. Just thoughts we should leave this room with.
I mean, my biggest takeaway is that we need to be thinking about systemic changes because we have a systemic problem. It's not enough just, I think as people said also in the last panel, what's been good about the ideas coming out here is the idea that we can come up with institutions, with systems, with relationships that systematically make it easier for small businesses to prosper, rather than saying, how do we teach individuals to become better entrepreneurs? But rather, again, as people have kept saying, how do we create those ecosystems that will enable ordinary people to survive in a productive way in this economy? Thanks.
So the entrepreneur first, under a good system, and everything else might just fall into place. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Neva Makgetla, a trade and industrial policy strategies expert from TIPS, Mr. Andile Ngube, cooperative banking promotion and advancement, representing financial institutions, Ms. Bertha Dlamini, president of the Women in Energy and Power, and also the CEO of the Rito Group of Companies, and Mr. Peter Sito, CEO of Vumelana Advisory Fund, really supporting and helping land reform beneficiaries. We really appreciate your time and your insights here today. I think this has been a great segue and setup for the third topic we'll be focused on today after lunch, which will be access to finance beyond grants, designing finance solutions for the collective. But I think this was a great stepping stone to that. Shall we break for lunch, Sis Gurley, and then proceed afterwards? Thank you so much. I think Sis Gurley Madumezulu wants to speak to us. Lunch and then move on. Okay, so we'll reconvene in about 45 minutes. Thank you. many of our colleagues will find us along the way. I'm not sure if this microphone is on, but I'm sure you can hear me. So our next section, and in fact the final thematic conversation or thought leadership conversation we're going to have this afternoon is titled Access to Finance Beyond Grants, Designing Finance Solutions for the Collective. I was traveling recently and I do a lot of work with DFIs across the continent, and a model was being held up. I can't quite remember where, but it's in East Africa somewhere. And what was said there, although those are bigger projects, certainly beyond the small that we're talking about, was that when we talk about innovative solutions in finance, hybrid models, blended finance, we need to think about the applicant or the recipient at the core. And in this particular instance, this company had a concept, it had been tested, or it had, the funding had been approved, and it had met all the compliance and due diligence requirements. But in the initial phase, it was just given grants. And then after that, they moved on to a model where the debt was not collected until the business proved commercial viability. So it actually was started by grants initially. When that grant ceiling was reached, they entered into a kind of a debt model where the loans did not need to be repaid until the business showed that it now had a commercial viability that could be tapped into. And so essentially it gave this business about 5 years of working capital, some space to develop, grow, make mistakes. And once you could see that their rollout to the market was commercially viable, it had that imperative, enter the loan or the equity agreements. So I think when we are talking, we need to think holistically as to what are the many, many mechanisms that can be used to fund SMEs. And remember, we're not talking about SMEs survivalists. We're talking about those that were referred to earlier on, those that are in the middle, that have really catapulted beyond their small scale, are in the medium range, but can't quite access funding for big, expansive businesses. So too big for micro, too small for commercial, somewhere in between, but really and truly ready to do something transformative. And so when we have this conversation, access to finance beyond grants, designing finance solutions for the collective, that's really the conversation we're having. Now, because this is quite a technical conversation, we're going to change moderators for somebody who's more adept at handling some of these technical issues. Your moderator for this session is Pindile Spies, the CEO of JASA, and she's worked extensively in the field of financing through localized DFIs for SMEs. And she's going to be joined by Mziwabantu Diamani, the CEO of the National Empowerment Fund, because they've got a very specific mandate. We've heard the president talk about the need to engender and nurture Black industrialists. This is what they do. Mr. Mandla Mbuyazi is going to also be on this panel. He is the Impact Investment and Ideation Lead at First Rand Empowerment Foundation. I think that's really important because where does DFI meet commercial lending? Ms. Leanne Emery Hunter, she's the CEO of the Chikululu Social Investments, really speaking to transformative social investments. And Ms. Tebogo Shabalala is with the Cooperative Banking Promotion and Advancement. I'm just going to say agency. I think that's not quite how we say it. But if you are Mziwabantu Djamani, Mandla Mbuyazi, Leanne Emery Hunter, Tebogo Shabalala, roll call. And please welcome warmly your moderator, Pindile Spies.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully we're not yet at the graveyard shift. I have been introduced as Pindi Lespies, and I come from an organization called Junior Achievement South Africa. We work with young people to inspire them to take space in the entrepreneurship sector. Our work is out of school activities where young people participate in entrepreneurial challenges where they start small businesses, run them for 29 weeks, and at the end of the 29 weeks, they join a competition. And as part of that competition, they need to pitch to judges that are independent and a seasoned professional and business people what they have been working on. And the winners, we start this at provincial level because we work across the country. The winners of that competition come to national competitions where they compete amongst themselves from different provinces. And again, we have a panel of seasoned professionals and business people judging the process. I am telling this story to say one of the issues that came up this morning was we need to unlock the entrepreneurial mindset. We work in schools in the public sector, in underserved communities, and I can tell you with a fact that South Africa does not lack talent. It lacks the unlocking of that talent. And if we could put more effort into exposing more young people at a young age to entrepreneurship, we are going to win this challenge. It might take 30 years, but the talent is there. Young people take up opportunity and they use it. I recently met an executive from Facebook locally, and he went through this program back in 2008 or something. And he said to me, the amazing thing about going through the program, even though he chose to go through the employment route, was how confident he was in walking into a big corporate and knowing that there are departments and these are the roles of each department and how he could interact with each one of them. So I just wanted to give a bit of a background of where I come from, but also to just say there is talent in this country. Let's nurture it as the adults in the room, and let's grow it so that young people can sit on this table and not speak about access and not speak about barriers and be discussing solutions to all of these things. So thank you for having me. I think my job has been done for me earlier in the morning because the panel before this one spoke extensively about funding and challenges around funding for different sectors. But I think this conversation is going to focus on structuring enterprises to become bankable and investable, designing finance that enables internal capital formation, and unlocking mechanisms that support cooperative growth at scale. And I will give each one of my panelists a chance to address one of the 4 questions that have been put forward today. And I will hope that at the end of this, we will have a Q&A that we will engage as people in the room, specialists in the room, and come up with some solutions that the team that has organized this can take forward and build onto. So my first panelist is Mr. Mzee from National Empowerment. The question that I will pose to you is, how can dynamic enterprises be organized into bankable value chains that can attract institutional investment and long-term finance what are the key structural gaps that exist or that impede this currently?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Mzi Daimani. I'm from the National Empowerment Fund. So the issue of building sustainable SMEs is one of the most topical issues, but it's one of those issues that not too many entities within the private and the public sector are actually focusing on. We do have support in the country, but with the amount of SMEs or businesses that we want to build as a country in order to deal with the challenges that we face, we need to have more support. Now the question is, how do we support them? One of the key challenges that SMEs are facing is the issue of markets. And I think that's one of the key ingredients. Finance is one of the aspects, but markets is key, because you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have anyone to supply or to sell to, you will not have a successful business. So it's very important to ensure that within the ecosystem, because that's one of the issues, we need an ecosystem. No one can build a business alone. Person needs support. And a lot of times SMEs don't have uncles and aunts. Some people are fortunate, they have those that can support them in their growth journey. Now the question is, if we are saying we want to bring everyone, we want this to be inclusive, irrespective of where you are in the country, irrespective of your background and the kind of personal support that you have. It means that we do need to have structural support that will support those who are unable to support themselves. So in the issue of the markets, we do need to ensure that we create those opportunities for markets. And the question is, how do we do that? Because naturally in business, it's networks. You work with people that you know, and you work with people that you actually come across. And not everyone has got access to those opportunities. And hence, we've got various initiatives within the South African environment, both in policy and also within the private space. And those need to be activated. Issues like the enterprise and supplier development, and also the networks that are created by established businesses. Because it's very important. I was very happy when I saw in one of the books that were given as part of this is the book by Professor Mohale, Lift As You Rise, because some people need someone to lift them up, otherwise they will never rise. And then in the businesses themselves, the issue of skills, because before you can give someone finance, you need to make sure that they can run the business. Because you provide them with finance, but they need to be able to, because in business, no one is going to say, because you come from this background, so you can give any product. You have to match the quality. So we need to focus on the issue of skills development in order to build entrepreneurs, because businesses are about entrepreneurs themselves. Then we can talk about the issue of funding. It's easy to provide funding to a business that has got higher chances of sustaining itself. And if it's a loan or equity, you know that you will make your return as an investor in that particular business. So the answer is that if you want to create those businesses, you need to make sure that you work on the fundamentals of the business, so that when you support it with finances and other means, you know that you are supporting a business that will be sustainable over time. Maybe let me pause there.
Thank you, Mzi. I will just do a follow-up question based on your response of saying markets and skills are some of the key aspects that businesses need. The businesses in the missing middle which we're speaking to today, need to be able to access funding. I would like to pose the question directly to you as CEO of NEF and ask what NEF has put in place to assist or to make it easier for such businesses and their value chains to access funding from you.
Okay. No, that's a very important question. So what we have learned, particularly with our target market, because we look at businesses that are owned by people who are actually at the lowest LSMs. And the reality is that when you go to a commercial financier, if you're asking for funding, one of the first things they will ask for is what is known as skin in the game, which is your own contribution. And we had to think differently to say, we have to make funding accessible even if you do not have the skin in the game, because the reality is that the target market that we're looking at, the majority of them don't have assets. They don't have money to provide a skin. They are committed to their businesses, but they don't have the resources. So we had to provide the funding without necessarily asking for own contribution. And we also had to look at the structures of the funding. In other words, you have to provide repayment holidays in order to allow the businesses space to breathe and to also get onto their feet before you can actually, so it means the funding has to become patient capital. So it became a challenge in the beginning because we don't necessarily get regular injection. In fact, if you look at our organization, the last time we received money from government was over 10 years ago. So it means that we had to make sure that with what we have to balance those developmental aspects to make sure that we are able to provide those payment holidays. But when these businesses eventually pay, they are able to return the funds so that you can recycle them over time. So the important part with the missing middle is that you can create sustainable businesses there. But you also have to make sure that you are managing your risk appetite because you are going to lose some money. And hence, when we look at our track record, we've realized that if you look at it rand for rand, we've been able to recover the money that we've put into the market with some return. But if you look also in terms of the losses we've made, we've lost quite significant amount of money, and it's bound to happen. You need to make sure that in the funding mix within the ecosystem, there is a mix of funding, for instance, from development financiers like ourselves, whose mandate is to take the risk. So you do need to have entities who have the mandate of taking the risk and will be open to taking the losses, but find ways of balancing those with the successes that they are making. At the same time, if you've got commercial funders, then it becomes easier for those businesses that as they graduate, then they are able to access that kind of funding which has got lesser risk. So you need to be able to have an enabling environment. I think we need to look at the ecosystem of financiers in the country as well, not only the businesses. There needs to be a funding mix that talks to the needs of the country.
Thank you, Mzi. I think you are speaking to collaboration in the process of this. And you also spoke to skin in the game. And skin in the game means that the entity must build its own capital, its own balance sheet, so that it can be able to de-risk, but also to support itself to a certain extent so that a funder can come in and take some risk knowing that there is some backing that the organization or the company itself can provide for itself. That gives confidence to the funder. But I will move right along to Mandla at this point and ask Mandla, what financing mechanisms can enable enterprises to build internal pools, which is the capital, and reduce dependency on external funding?
Hi guys, my name is Mandla Mbuyazi. I'm from First Rand Empowerment. I'm from First Rand. And First Rand Group is a conglomerate bank that has different arms to it. And I look after the interests of our foundations. We've got First Rand Foundation and First Rand Empowerment Foundation. I look after impact investing and ideation for those foundations. My background is in the commercial space within the bank. I've worked for RMB for many years before moving into the space. So for me, what has been very striking is the adjustment from a very pure commercial approach towards capital based on the businesses that are sitting there on the ground where we're dealing with corporates and institutions. So we're dealing with the Premier League. If you have to engage things in a league, in a league perspective, we're dealing with a Premier League to come into a space where we are engaging things at a philanthropic level. And I've always been passionate because part of the capital providers that I've worked with are the institutions. It's pension funds. So I looked after pension funds for many years, and pension funds have been trying to grapple with the idea of having capital contribute towards unlocking opportunities in South Africa, but also at the same time meet the objectives, the headline objectives as capital. So the reason I'm mentioning this is engaging in the question of access to finance. In fact, I'm just going to pick up on the conversation that happened earlier that spoke about affordable capital. Thank you, Sand. That spoke about affordable capital, that on the one end, you've got risk, and on the other end, you've got return on a seesaw. When it comes to risk and return, in the pure commercial sense, the scale must balance. If you get into spaces where there's high risk, there must be opportunity for high return in those spaces. But once you go lower in terms of the SMME space, what starts to happen is that it becomes expensive to find those type of opportunities in those spaces. So commercial capital, they then look at it becomes at what's available on the pocket. There's a limitation on the pocket, and there are spaces that they're not going to go beyond. That's actually part of the things that creates the missing middle. Is okay, it's too expensive for us to go in there, and the cost plus the risk, they do not balance with the potential return. So therefore, we will not gonna go and play in that space. And that's where development and finance comes into play. That's where a philanthropic capital could come into the space to reach that gap. And there, they can play one of three layers in terms of activities. One layer is pure grant space, and at grant space, it's you're talking technical assistance, helping people with feasibility studies, helping people with building business plans, and also engaging at the research and development, research and advocacy piece. So there are gaps in the market that exist. One of the gaps is perception of risk. And perception, I mentioned perception because commercial banks sometimes don't go into spaces because there is a perceived risk. It's not necessarily a real risk, but it's a perceived risk. And grant capital come into that space and can play a role of unlocking or proving points or proving models or building onto models into that space. So that's grant capital could play in a space. And then the next layer is what you call risky capital, catalytic capital is what we call it. There, you are going to go and play in a space knowing, and I think that's probably partly where the national, the NEF kind of plays. You know that it's a risky space. You're going to provide capital. You're going to make inferences. You're going to extrapolate certain information based on what you see on the ground, and you're going to provide capital into the spaces, and you're going to hope for a return that will also help to sustain this model into the space. People either play in that space by maybe diversifying their portfolio. Maybe they've got a portion of their portfolio that they know is not as risky, as probably has more opportunity of providing return, but the other part of that portfolio is going to be risky, and they might lose some they might lose some, but you don't want to lose the whole entire T-shirt in the game, in the space. So yes, you play in that space. Catalytic capital, as a philanthropy, as a development finance institution, you come in there and you still expect, you are still prudent in how you measure your risk, but you are okay with the amount of risk versus the potential return that you're going to receive on that. So you play, you know that, and the capital you bring into the space will unlock the commercial funders. So we're speaking about at grant, you're still proving, you're building proof points, you're removing perception, and you're testing what's perception as real, what is reality and what is real, what is risk. You move to the catalytic capital space. In that space, you don't expect the lights to be shot out, but if they do, that's great. But you get into a space where commercial funders don't play. And then at the next layer is what we call the impact investing type of capital. And then in that space, that's when you are very deliberate on your financial return alongside an impact. So if you have to think about it, this side is mostly impact. Now you get into a space where you are actually saying, I'm deliberate about my impact measures plus my financial returns in the space. So I'm saying all of this to just highlight the different type of capital players in the space, collaborating to unlock the capital layer into the space. There is going to be risky capital, there is going to be grant capital, there is going to be senior capital and capital that requires to receive a financial return, all playing their parts, their roles. And to the SMME, that looks, or to the economy, that looks like affordable capital. Because all of a sudden, where there was perception that there was an adjustment of how that risk was priced, and so on and so forth. So this is just me to say, in this entire space, that different providers, development finance institution plays their role, philanthropy capital plays their role, public capital plays their role, banks will play their role. In terms of how they play, there's many ways that they can play, but yeah, that's the ecosystem.
Thank you, Mandla. I will come back to you, but I think what I am picking up is that to build capital, small businesses or the business in the missing middle need a blended approach to funding. They need grant, and then they will need patient capital that will allow them to make mistakes and bring themselves back again and learn through the process. But grant is not money that is always available. And at this moment, I'm going to bring in Lee, because her role or her organization plays or provides funding in the grant space. And Lee, do you think funders should be thinking differently or using a different approach to funding? Maybe let me just bring in the cooperatives as well, and not just limited to SMEs.
Thanks so much. So hello, everyone. My name is Leanne, but everybody calls me Lee. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Chikalulu Social Investments. So what we do is we advise clients on their social impact problems, and we manage funds on behalf of clients, funds and foundations. So very often our mandates are based on our clients' needs and our clients' mandates, and how we assist them in investing in either community upliftment, specific social impact challenges, and more in the space of, let's say, livelihood and economic diversification and small businesses. So should corporates be thinking differently? Absolutely. And I think there's an appetite. So what we are seeing, to Z and Mandla's points, is this value chain of funding. That's the grant is the patient funding that de-risks the organization. Then we go into the patient funding and then the catalytic capital. But very often it's not necessarily by design. So I think there's an appetite for clients to think, corporates to think, firstly, how do I integrate my own elements? Because often these elements are siloed. So an organization may have a CSI program, an ESD program, an SED program, an ESG, all the acronyms. So we are speaking more and more to our clients to say, you have a bursary program, how can that connect with your ESD program? You have a community upliftment program. How do we ensure that as we are supporting small businesses, that we've always thought about small businesses being sustainable, but how do we then integrate them into other elements of your business, and how do we connect one another? I think we talk about partnership a lot. We talk about collaboration a lot, but I think it's tougher in reality than when we speak about it. And there's certainly an appetite and an intention, and I can see so often that there's enormous will for good and enormous will for change, but sometimes somewhere in the design and the connection of the funding mechanisms to the programs and the connecting to one another, that the intention is lost. So more and more we're thinking about how do we firstly integrate from an organizational point of view the various programs that you are working on. How do we integrate from a regional point of view? We work a lot with mining clients, and often there's challenges within communities that actually, if we tackle them together, we would be far more transformational than if it was done in silos. And then also thinking more and more about how do we connect the various funding mechanisms. So how do we, when we design a program with a client, think about this is a long-term systemic play. This is not just a program that I'm implementing. And if you want to implement systemic change, it takes patience, it takes collaboration, and it takes real deliberation in how you think about the project into the future. And I think from a cooperative point of view, it's very interesting, because if I'm in a network, if I'm in a value chain, I'm far less risky to invest in than if I'm a singular SME that as a business I'm taking a chance on. So if we can think, and I think there are pockets where this is done very well. I think the Green Outcomes Fund is a very good example of an excellent coordination of de-risking grant funding, more catalytic funding, concessional funding. There's great examples in the Galapagos Islands, believe it or not, amazing vehicle nature swap. But certainly we're seeing an appetite to think about things differently. There's some success, but I think it will require us all to collaborate better and ensure that when we're thinking about programs, interventions, systemic change, that we are thinking in you mentioned it, Lindsay, in an ecosystem view, and not in a silo view, which takes a different kind of thinking. And I think it takes also a little bit of bravery and a boldness to be able to take decisions that, that you won't necessarily see the impact 1 year. Maybe there's a 5-year or a 10-year view that is often difficult, and particularly in the space that we operate, where we're often looking at CSI spend, where you've got to report annually and quarterly on where your spend went. So, but I'm certainly seeing that there's an appetite, and we are advising our clients that we've been doing things the same way and expecting different results. So there needs to be a step change. And I think even just, by the way, on this panel, if we were to think about things between us, I think there could be an interesting ecosystem that we could, consider. So I was just thinking about all the people sitting here and thinking, gosh, there could be an interesting way that we could integrate things.
Thank you, Lee. Maybe just a follow-up question to that. You spoke about funders looking at integrating their own products, and would adding funders considering the clients that they fund to also be their suppliers, be a way of de-risking.
Absolutely, and that's certainly a part of the program design, is to say, okay, so we're doing a livelihoods diversification program where we're looking at SMEs under R1 million that we're looking to invest in, but the stated the stated objective is to ensure that they are developed into organizations that can go into their value chain and they can become part of their supply networks in future.
I see Mandla wants to add to that. I'll allow you, Mandla, because
That excites me to hear that, because part of the analysis or immersion that I've been trying to do into the space is to understand the ESD world. The ESD world, for some reason, is not engaging, is funding inputs, not outputs, not outcomes. It's funding inputs. It's really about ticking the box for the corporates. And there's a lot of money that sits in there. And to just spell out some of the money, it's 2% of net profit after tax. That's sinking for corporate South Africa. If you just look at the top 40 stocks of South Africa, that becomes humongous immediately. And that money, literally every year, becomes 1 year programs that get farmed into the space. And it's really, when it gets farmed, typically the programs that I see, it's really measuring the money that is outgoing and not necessarily engaging the outcomes of what that money is engaging. So for me, when I think about that space, I've been struggling to find programs that are able to link the two, that are able to link the fact that we are developing a pipeline for suppliers so that they can assist us, right? And we're putting money for such. And then these guys, for a bank, these guys a pipeline for banking clients and a pipeline for other commercial funding that you can provide them. That whole loophole is difficult.
do you want to add?
Yeah, a very interesting conversation. So, and I think under also is something very important to say. The amount of money that gets allocated to enterprise development vis-a-vis the outcomes that we see, there's a mismatch. So what this means is that there is no coordination and there is no, I think you mentioned it, there is no ecosystem, there is no collaboration. So it calls for all of us, and it's gonna take each one of us taking responsibility for this, because part of the reason is that some people are saying this is left to government, or this is something that I do for me to get points. I do it because I have to do it. But if we thought about it differently, to say, let's do this because we can see the potential that we can achieve if we do it correctly. And if we can have that mindset change, then we can find ways of working together. And it's about real collaboration. Because you find, for instance, the private sector saying, look, I don't trust government that they can do this. And government maybe is coming and saying, give me the money, I'll do the right things. And the private sector says, okay, do we trust you to do it? But if we can say, let's take a step back, let's do this, but let's do it together. And let's find a way of holding each other accountable. And let's find people that we all trust. If we say, for instance, we all trust me to do this thing, if it's in his head, the right things will be done. Then let's all rally around me. Let's work with him and let's say these are the outcomes that we want to achieve. Because for as long as we don't write and say this is what we want to see as the outcomes of what we're doing, we're just going to keep shooting at nothing and hitting it all the time.
Thank thank you, panelists. I think what's coming out of this conversation is intentionality in the use of funding that is available to be invested, and I'm saying invested, into the development of the ecosystem. And that funding or use of that funding should move away from being a compliant activity to being an intentional investment in the growth of the economy. So I think with that, we will bring in Teboko, who has vast experience in cooperative finance systems. And Teboko, my question to you is, what financial mechanisms or reforms would most unlock cooperative growth at a scale?
Because I'm the last speaker. So I'm from SETVA, but I'm from the Cooperative Banking Promotion and Advancement Unit. So our role, I think, like my colleague said earlier, is to promote and capacitate cooperative banking institutions. So those are co-ops that are in the banking space, meaning they can provide, financial services or products that are provided in the banking sector, but they are a type. We've got cooperative banks, we've got mutual banks, and we've got commercial banks. So they are in the cooperative banking space. When I think what has been said here sort of summarizes what cooperative banking institutions actually do. We're talking about people who are brave enough without banking knowledge to establish a cooperative banking institution as a self-help entity where they pool their funds together, not government funding, but they funds together and they finance what their need is. What we've seen lately is there's been a rise in cooperative banking institutions that have applied for application. They are regulated by the Reserve Bank, by the Prudential Authority, but they've applied where their main objective is to finance their MSMEs and cooperatives. Yes, it's a cooperative banking institution, but its members can be anyone, can be individuals, can be SMEs, can be cooperatives, can be informal traders, anyone within the space they operate in. And cooperative banking institutions have been seen as the key intermediary to finance local economic development. Because remember, it is formed by the individuals within that space. And where we come in with our unit is then capacitate them into the technicalities around running a banking institution based on the basics that they have. We're not saying it's easy, but that's an entry. I think cooperative banking is an entry in the banking space, or was part of those entities, or when the Cooperative Banks Act was established, it was mainly around financial sector transformation, but also talks to financial inclusion. Because if you look at our financial inclusion policy, it talks to MSMEs, right? Access to finance for MSMEs, but even how they operate. But it also talks specifically to cooperative banking, promoting cooperative banking and developing cooperative banking as one of the intermediaries that can be used by MSMEs to access these funds. Because when you're talking financial inclusion, we're talking not just having a bank card, right? It's beyond that. Having access to financial services that serve your needs, whether it's an MSME, as a co-op, or an individual. And this is where cooperative banking institutions come in. And they're not necessarily there to compete with commercial banks or mutual banks, but they are an alternative. For if something doesn't work in this entity, it would work for you in your own cooperative banking institution. Meaning, we've got, I think it was the first time this year that cooperative banking institutions were actually funded by government. They've been throughout the years. I think this act was established in 2007, but they've been existing beyond that, before that. Maybe there was no act in place. The likes of Falsters in my times, the likes of Falsters, it was a co-op. It was a loan Volkswagen Bank was a loan cooperative, and it transitioned into one of the big banks in the country, and then they amalgamated and became ABSA with your allied banks. What we're saying is it starts somewhere, but this is where cooperative banking institutions start. This is where they are, and they respond to the needs of the people on the ground. I mean, yes, South Africa is not necessarily doesn't have one of the best performing cooperative banking institutions in the country. There's been talks about regulatory burden compliance. However, we've also seen that when you look at the cooperative space, cooperative banking institutions are actually more sustainable than any other type of co-op in the country. And you could say it could be because of regulation, but also it's people who are self-starters, people who are looking for that self-help type of entity then to finance their needs as MSMEs, co-ops, and individuals in the space they operate.
Thank you, Deborah. So, in essence, you're saying that the SMEs in the missing middle maybe should look at forming a cooperative bank, which will be not regulated, but managed by them for their own interest, so that they can build this value chain and be able to accelerate it to a point where it now gets to the development finance institutions to take over and the commercial banks to take over.
Exactly that. And then I think, but it also talks to collaboration. I think we spoke public funds, we spoke private funds, but also the co-ops come in a form of individuals, the citizens themselves saying, we have this, you're coming in on something that we already have. You're building on something that we already have, proof of concept already that's there. And I mean, because they've got a social aspect also attached to it. It also means they're not just seen as a banking entity, but an entity that's part of the value chain in whatever space they operate in. There was a study done by the World Bank years ago, I think 2014 on Ipswich, and they were looking at how many times money circulates within Ipswich. And it circulates a few times and it leaves the township. And one of the key reasons there is that because they don't own whatever that they buy from. They are consumers, they don't own the shops, or they don't own the products that they consume in the space they live in. And now if you look, for example, at the likes of Oranje Cooperative Bank, which is one of the biggest cooperative banks in the country, they've created such a value chain that their cooperative bank is at the center of that value chain. The money circulates among meaning even if you're a baker, you need supplies for that